There's a place where the evening comes in slowly, the way warm water fills a bath, rising by degrees, softening every edge it touches. You have been there before, though perhaps not in this life. Perhaps in the quiet between sleeping and waking, in the moment just before your body remembers it is tired. That place has always been waiting for you. It has never been in a hurry. Her name was Maren, and she had learned over many years that the most important things in life arrived without announcement, not with fanfare or urgency, but the way light does gradually, then all at once, then so completely that you could not imagine a time before it. She was 43 years old, and she lived in a house near the edge of a salt marsh, where the land was neither fully earth nor fully water. The reeds grew tall and pale gold in late autumn, and the sky above them held colors that had no proper names, the kind of colors that existed only in a specific hour of a specific season, colors that made people stop walking and simply stand still for a moment, breathing. Maren had stopped trying to describe those colors to people who hadn't seen them. Some things, she had decided, were for keeping. The house itself was small. It had a wide front porch that creaked pleasantly underfoot, the kind of sound that said you are home with every step. Inside, the ceilings were low, and the walls were the color of old cream. There were bookshelves in every room, even the bathroom, and a kitchen that smelled perpetually of something warm, cinnamon or dried herbs, or the particular wooden sweetness of a cast iron pan that had been well used for decades. She lived alone, but she did not feel alone. This distinction mattered to her. The marsh was her companion in the mornings. She would stand at the kitchen window with her tea, watching the mist lift off the water in long, slow curls, and she felt the day begin not with the shock of an alarm or the rush of obligation, but with something gentler, the sense that she was being invited into the hours ahead, the way a good host opens a door and steps aside to let you enter at your own pace. On this particular evening, the evening where our story begins, Maren was doing something she did every year in late October. She was making a list, not a list of tasks or errands or things she had forgotten to do. She was making what she called her keeping list, a record of everything from the past year that had been worth keeping. The small things, mostly. The significant ones tended to keep themselves. It was the small ones that slipped away if you didn't write them down. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea cooling beside her and a notebook with a green linen cover, the pages soft from use. The lamp cast a warm amber circle around her, and beyond the window the marsh had gone dark and still, the way it did in the deep part of autumn when even the wind seemed to be resting. She wrote slowly. There was no rush. The way the bread came out perfect on a Thursday in February. The blackbird that sat on the porch railing every morning in March and seemed entirely unbothered by my presence. The phone call with my sister that lasted 4 hours and left me feeling like I had been given something back I didn't know I'd lost. The particular quality of the light on the afternoon of the spring equinox, when it came through the west window and turned everything in the kitchen briefly to gold. She paused and looked at what what she had written. Outside, the reeds made their soft sound, not quite rustling, more like breathing. The sound of a world settling in for the night. She was about to write the next item on her list when she noticed something she had not noticed before. In the corner of the kitchen, near the bottom shelf of the bookcase, there was a small door. Maren set down her pen. She was quite certain the door had not been there yesterday. She was quite certain, in fact, that the bookcase sat flush against a solid wall, and that the solid wall backed onto the utility space beneath the stairs, and that there was therefore no room for a door of any kind, small or otherwise. And yet, it was approximately 2 feet tall and 18 inches wide, framed in pale wood, with a small round knob the color of old bronze. It was closed. Along its lower edge, a thin line of soft light showed warm and yellowish, like candlelight or firelight, or the particular light of a room where someone has been sitting quietly for a very long time. Maren did not feel afraid. This was perhaps the strangest part of the whole thing. She felt, if anything, the opposite of afraid. She felt the way she felt on the first morning of a holiday, waking in a room she didn't know, sunlight coming in at an unfamiliar angle, the pleasant, untethered feeling of a day with no fixed obligations. She picked up her tea and took a slow sip. Then she set it down and crossed the kitchen, and without quite deciding to, got down onto her hands and knees in front of the small door and looked at it more closely. The wood was smooth and slightly warm to the touch. The light along the bottom edge was steady, not flickering. There was a smell, faint but clear, of wood smoke and something botanical, like lavender or rosemary or some herb she didn't have a name for. A living smell, a tended smell, the kind of smell that meant someone was home. She did not open the door that night. She went back to her table, picked up her pen, and added one more item to her keeping list. The small door that appeared in October and smelled of wood smoke and something that was probably, almost certainly, kindness. Then she closed the notebook, washed her teacup, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. She fell asleep easily, which surprised her a little, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Some discoveries, she thought as her eyes closed, were the kind that settled you rather than unsettled you. The kind that made the night feel more spacious, not less. She dreamed of a room filled with warm light, and the sound of something, rain, maybe, or a quiet river, moving gently past a window. In the morning, the door was still there. Maren stood in the kitchen in her robe with her tea and looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something you want to understand before you disturb it. The morning light made everything in the kitchen soft and gray gold, and the small door sat in its corner looking patient and entirely unsurprised to be seen. She made breakfast. Eggs, toast, a sliced pear. She ate at the table with a book open beside her, though she read very little of it. Mostly she looked at the door. What she felt, she decided, was curiosity, but a particular kind of curiosity, not the sharp, restless kind that demanded immediate answers, but the slow, warm kind that was content to let understanding arrive at its own pace. The kind of curiosity that felt more like readiness than urgency. After breakfast, She washed the dishes, dried them, put them away. She swept the kitchen floor. She refilled the bird feeder outside the window. She realized, tidying the way you tidy before company comes. Not because the house was dirty, but because the act of tidying was a kind of welcoming, a way of saying I am prepared to receive something. When there was nothing left to do, she got down again on her hands and knees before the small door. She knocked twice, softly. 3 short taps with her knuckle, the way you knock on a door when you are not sure if anyone is home, but you don't want to startle them. From the other side of the door, after a moment, came 2 soft taps in response. Maren smiled. She had not known until that moment that she had been hoping for exactly that. She turned the bronze knob. It was perfectly warm in her palm, the temperature of a hand, and she opened the door. The light that came through was gentle and amber, and it carried with it, unmistakably, the smell of wood smoke and that living herbal sweetness she had noticed the night before. She looked through the opening and saw, though this was impossible architecturally, and she was aware of this, a room. It was a small room. The floor was stone, smooth and pale, and there were woven rugs in soft colors, ochre and deep green and the faded red of old roses. There was a fireplace along one wall with a low fire burning in it, the kind of fire that was not roaring or dramatic, but simply present, a steady orange gold warmth. Against the opposite wall, there was a narrow wooden table with a clay pot on it, and from the pot grew something green and tall with small white flowers that released, when they moved, as they were moving slightly now, in some invisible current of warm air. A fragrance so gentle and clean it made Maren think of sleeping. There were shelves as well. Everywhere there were shelves, and on the shelves were jars and bottles and small wooden boxes and bundles of dried herbs tied with string and stacks of folded cloth and smooth river stones in groups of 3 or 5, and objects she didn't have names for, objects that seemed to exist for no purpose but beauty. And in a low chair by the fire, with a piece of knitting in her lap and a lamp on a small table beside her, sat a woman. She was old, not frail old, but settled old, the way an oak tree is old, fully arrived at herself, occupying her age without apology. Her hair was white and pinned loosely at the back of her head, and she wore a dark green dress and wool stockings and shoes that looked extremely comfortable. Her face was weathered in the way that meant a life spent outdoors, and her eyes, when she looked up from her knitting, were a color Maren couldn't name, like the marsh in certain light, like water that held sky. She looked at Maren the way someone looks at a person they have been expecting. "Come in, then," she said. Her voice was unhurried and dry, with the particular warmth of someone who didn't waste warmth, but meant it entirely when they used it. "You'll need to duck." Maren ducked through the small door and found, upon entering, that the room was impossibly exactly the right size for her. She could stand fully upright. The ceiling was low, but not confining. The room wrapped around her like something warm and familiar. She looked back at the door. From the inside, it was full-sized. "Sit," the woman said, and gestured to a second low chair that had been pulled to the other side of the fire, as if it had been placed there in anticipation of a guest. Maren sat. The chair received her completely, the way good chairs do, and the warmth of the fire settled on her skin, and she looked at the woman across the hearth and said, because it was the only honest thing she could think to say, "I don't know what to ask first." "You don't need to ask anything," the woman said, not unkindly. "Not yet. Just sit. The fire will do the rest." And so Maren sat, and the fire burned, and the small white flowers on the tall clay plant moved gently in the warm air, and the woman knitted, her needles making a soft, rhythmic sound that was, Maren noticed, almost exactly like rain. Not rain on glass or rain on a roof, but rain on leaves, the patient sound of water finding its way through green things. Outside or in the other place, the place that was Maren's kitchen, the autumn morning continued without her for a while, and it seemed entirely content to do so. She stayed for what felt like an hour, though it might have been longer or shorter. She didn't check. For once in a very long time, she wasn't tracking the time. She watched the fire. The fire gave her nothing in return except warmth and light, which, she was beginning to understand, was everything. The woman's name was Sepha. She told Maren this on the third day, when Maren came back through the small door in the late afternoon with a tin of shortbread she had made that morning, because it had seemed wrong to keep arriving empty-handed. Sepha had accepted the tin without ceremony, set it on the narrow wooden table beside the clay plant, and given her name as easily as she gave everything, without fuss, without performance. "Sepha," Maren repeated, trying it. "It means peace," Sepha said. "Where I come from, or something like peace. There isn't a perfect translation." She resumed her knitting. There never is. Maren had come to understand, over those first few days, that Sepha was not a spirit or a vision or a dream, though she possessed qualities of all three. She was simply Sepha, a woman who lived in a room that existed between walls, or beneath staircases, or in the space the world kept folded neatly away for when it was needed. A woman who had been there, perhaps, for a very long time, or perhaps no time at all. Maren had stopped trying to resolve this. It was like trying to measure the marsh with a ruler. What Sepha did was listen. She listened the way the marsh listened, with the whole of her attention, without inserting herself, without hurrying you toward a conclusion. She knitted while you talked, and the needles made their rain sound, and the fire held steady, and you found, without quite understanding how, that you were saying things you had not intended to say. Things you had been carrying for so long that you had stopped feeling their weight, and only recognized them as your own once they were outside you. On the fourth day, Maren talked about her mother. She hadn't planned to. She had arrived with a question about the white flowered plant, its name, where it came from, and instead had found herself, 20 minutes later, telling Sepha about the summer her mother had come to stay in the house by the marsh, 3 years before she died. How they had sat on the wide porch in the evenings and watched the light change over the water, and her mother had said once, softly, without looking at her, "I think I got some things wrong with you," and Maren had said you got more things right, and they had never spoken of it again, but something had shifted between them, quietly and permanently, like tectonic plates adjusting. She knew, Sepha said. Yes, Maren said. I think she did. And you knew? Yes. Then it was said, Sepha said simply. Even without the words, it was said. Maren looked at the fire for a long time after that. The tightness she had not known she was carrying, a tightness that lived, she discovered, in the upper part of her chest, just below the collarbone, released itself with the slow, quiet thoroughness of a knot untied, not pulled apart, but loosened, loop by loop, until the rope lay easy. Outside, the marsh was still there, golden and patient, doing what it always did, holding everything that came to its edge, reflecting the sky. On the 5th day, Sepha was knitting something new. The color was a deep, grounded blue-green, the color of moss, almost, or deep sea glass, or the part of the afternoon sky that comes just before evening. Maren watched the yarn move between the needles and felt something she could only describe as contentment, which was different from happiness in the way that a warm house in winter is different from a bonfire, less spectacular, more sustaining. What are you making? She asked. Sepha turned the work and began a new row. I am not entirely sure yet, she said. I find it's best with some things to work a while before you decide what they are. Maren laughed, a small, surprised laugh, and Sepha's expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something in that direction, something in the neighborhood of warmth. On the 6th day, it rained. Maren sat in Sepha's chair by the fire and listened to the rain on the roof of her own house. She could hear it faintly through the small door, and the rain in the room was only the sound of the knitting needles, and she thought about how she had been bracing herself lately without realizing it. Bracing for what? She couldn't entirely say. For the next thing. For the thing that would require her to be strong or capable or composed. She had been standing slightly forward on her feet, metaphorically speaking, for a very long time. You can set it down, Sepha said, without looking up. Whatever you're carrying. She clicked her needles. You can set it down here. It will be here when you want it back, if you want it back. But I find, she said, that people rarely do. Maren breathed in slowly, breathed out slowly. Let something in her shoulders lower by a fraction, then more, then more. The fire popped once, softly, like a small, benevolent punctuation mark. The rain came down outside. Here, inside, the needles kept their steady rain sound, and the lamp spread its amber light, and the white flowers on the tall clay plant moved in their slow, private way, releasing their clean, sleeping smell. Maren closed her eyes. She was not asleep. She was in that country between sleeping and waking, the same country where she had always been able to feel the place by the marsh, the warm, unhurried country. She was there now, fully, without trying. She stayed until the light outside had changed and the rain had softened to a mist. And then she said good night to Sepha and ducked back through the small door and stood in her kitchen and felt the ordinary, beautiful, familiar weight of her own house around her. She made soup. She ate it. She went to bed early and slept a long and dreamless sleep. The kind of sleep that restores you so thoroughly that you wake not merely rested, but remade. As if while you were unconscious, the world had been quietly putting things back in order, returning everything to its proper place, readying the morning for you like a gift. The marsh had its own language, and Maren had been learning it for years. She knew that a still morning with low mist meant a long, clear afternoon. She knew the particular behavior of the herons, the way they stood motionless for such extended periods that they seemed less like birds and more like the idea of patience made visible. She knew the difference between the sound the reeds made in a light wind and the sound they made in a coming storm. And she knew, too, the deep silence they made on the mornings after rain, a silence that had texture to it, that felt present and alive rather than empty. She thought about language a great deal that week, the languages we speak and the ones we don't, and whether the most important things we communicate to each other ever travel through words at all. She mentioned this to Sepha on the 7th day, and Sepha set down her knitting. She rarely set down her knitting, Maren had noticed, and looked at her with those water-sky eyes for a moment before she answered. My grandmother, Sepha said, never learned to read, not because she couldn't have, but because she didn't need to. Everything she needed to know, she said, was written on things that already existed. The sky, the way a door hangs, the sound a fire makes when it's being well fed versus when it's being neglected. She picked her knitting back up. She was not a superstitious woman. She was a very practical one. She just had a different understanding of where the information was stored. Maren thought about this for several days afterward. She walked the marsh path in the gray October mornings, the reeds rising on either side of her, the water on her left darkening as it deepened, and she practiced reading the things around her the way Sepha's grandmother had. Not looking for meaning in a mystical sense, not searching for omens or signs, but simply paying attention. Attending. Noticing the world's own language, which had always been there, spoken continuously, for anyone with the patience to listen. A flock of small, dark birds moved over the marsh like a single thought. The water near the bank was clear enough to show the bottom, pale and sandy, with thin dark grasses swaying. A spider had built a web between two reed stems, and in the morning damp, the web held thousands of droplets, each one containing a tiny, upside-down image of the sky. Maren stopped walking and looked at the web for a long time. She thought about the fact that a spider builds a web not to create beauty, but to catch what it needs to survive. And yet the web is, indisputably, beautiful. She thought about whether that was a coincidence or whether beauty and function were, at the deepest level, the same thing. She didn't reach a conclusion, but she kept the question, and the keeping of it felt worthwhile. That evening, she came back through the small door and told Sepha about the web. Yes, Sepha said. She said it the way she said most things, simply, without elaboration, but with a quality of agreement that felt specific rather than general, the agreement of someone who has seen the same thing and recognized it from a great distance. You've seen one like that. I've seen many, she paused, but each one is its own. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while. This was something Maren had come to appreciate about Sepha's company. The silences were as easy as the conversations, and sometimes more valuable. The fire gave off its steady warmth, and the knitting accumulated slowly in Sepha's lap, and Maren felt the particular pleasure of being with someone in a room without needing to fill the room with sound. She had forgotten, she realized, how much she valued this. The people she spent time with in her ordinary life were good people, people she loved, but most of them were uncomfortable with silence. They filled it reflexively, not from rudeness, but from a kind of nervousness, a feeling that silence meant something had gone wrong. She had spent so much time in social spaces managing other people's discomfort with quiet that she had stopped noticing, until now, how much energy that had cost her. "You're thinking about someone," Sepha said. "Several someones," Maren said. "People who can't sit still. Something like that." Sepha clicked her needles. "They're not wrong to be nervous of it," she said. "Silence shows you things not everyone is ready to see." "What does it show you?" "Different things for different people." She glanced up briefly. "For you, I think it shows you yourself, which is why you've always been drawn to it, and to places like this." She looked back at her knitting. "And to the marsh." Maren thought about this. It felt true in the way that things felt true when you hadn't known them consciously, but recognized them as soon as they were said, a recognition with weight to it, the weight of something long confirmed, finally articulated. She stayed until the fire had burned lower, and the light in the room had softened from amber to something warmer, a deeper gold, the color of last light over water. She felt rested in a way that went beyond physical rest, rested in layers, the way sleep sometimes reaches down into the deeper places and tends to them. When she left, Sepha said, as she always did, "Come back when you're ready. Not come back tomorrow, not come back soon. Always when you're ready," which implied that the door would be there whenever that was, which Maren had come to understand was not so much a promise as a simple statement of fact. The door was there when she needed it. Outside in the kitchen, the world was dark and still, and the marsh was somewhere out there in the October night, breathing its long, slow breath. And Maren stood for a moment at the window and felt herself, for the first time in a long time, completely still, not stalled or suspended, but genuinely still, the way water is still when it is deep and undisturbed. She slept well that night, and the night after, and the night after that. There are seasons within seasons, and October has its own interior calendar that most people don't notice because they are too busy counting down to other things. Maren had been counting the interior seasons for years. The week in mid-October, when the light became horizontal instead of overhead, laying itself across the landscape like a slow golden tide. The particular day, different each year, identifiable only in retrospect, when the air stopped smelling of harvest and began smelling of something older, darker, the rich, organic smell of things returning to earth. The morning, when the first frost came and the reeds along the marsh path were coated in crystals so fine and intricate they looked like the work of some artist who worked only in the very small, and only at night, and never signed anything. She had woken on just such a morning that week and gone straight to the window, and the marsh had glittered below the gray sky with thousands of points of cold light. And she had felt, as she always did on such mornings, a specific and irreducible gratitude. Not gratitude directed at anything in particular, not a transactional gratitude, but gratitude as a state of being. Gratitude as a way of standing in the world. She had brought this feeling with her through the small door that afternoon and told Sepha about it. Sepha had listened and then said, "What does it feel like? Gratitude, if you had to put it in the body." Maren considered. "Like my chest opens," she said, "not uncomfortably, like a room opening up, like there's more space in there than I remembered." "That's right," Sepha said. "That's what it is." She knitted a few more rows. Most people think gratitude is about the thing they're grateful for. But the thing is only the door. The feeling is the room. Maren turned this over and found it true. She had been spending more time lately in that room, not forcing herself there. She had learned long ago that you cannot manufacture gratitude any more than you can manufacture dawn. Only position yourself to receive it. But she had been positioning herself more deliberately. Less scrolling, more looking out windows. Less rushing, more arriving. Less filling the day and more being inside it. She mentioned to Sepha one afternoon that she had been thinking about a letter she wanted to write. "To whom?" Sepha asked. "A friend I haven't spoken to properly in several years," Maren said. "Not because of any particular falling out. Only because life moved the way it does, and we moved with it in different directions. And then enough time had passed that reaching out felt complicated, like there was too much to account for." "There never is," Sepha said. "I know. I think I've known for a while." "What would you say if you wrote it?" Maren thought about this for a moment, looking at the fire. "That I still think about her often, that I hope she's well, that I miss her specific way of laughing at things." She paused. "That I'm sorry it took so long." "That last part," Sepha said, "is almost never necessary. The person who receives an unexpected letter from someone who has thought about them kindly for years doesn't care how long it took. They only feel the letter arriving." She looked up. "Write it." Maren wrote it the following morning, at the kitchen table, with her tea and her green notebook, and the door waiting quietly in its corner, while she drafted 3 versions and sent none of them, and then wrote a 4th version, short and plain and honest, and folded it and addressed the envelope before she could reconsider. She walked to the village to post it, 2 miles along the marsh path, with the frost still on the reeds in the shaded places, the sun low and white, her breath a small visible cloud in the cold air. She put the letter in the box and walked home, and the walk home felt different from the walk out, lighter, which was the obvious thing, but also quieter, less tangled, as if something internal had been rearranged into a more spacious configuration. She had been doing this, she realized, in small ways across many weeks. Rearranging the interior, not redecorating, not renovating, only gently moving things to where they fit better, to where the light reached them, to where she could find them when she needed them. She wondered if this was what Sepha had been knitting toward all along. When she came back through the small door that afternoon, she found the fire burning as steadily as ever, and the white flowered plant moving in its warm, invisible current, and Sepha in her chair. But on the narrow table beside the clay pot, there was something new, a small folded piece of paper, and on it, in handwriting that was not Sepha's, and yet somehow familiar, a handwriting she felt she had known all her life without knowing where were written these words: "The door is yours now. You know how to open it." Maren stood very still and looked at the note for a moment. Then she looked at Sepha. "It means," Sepha said, before she could ask, "that you no longer need me to hold it for you." She said it without sadness, the way you say a true thing that is neither good nor bad, but simply true. The door was always inside you. This one was only practice. Maren sat down in her chair one more time. The fire burned. The needles clicked. The white flowers moved. She was there for a long time. Sepha did not disappear. This was something Maren had feared, in a quiet way, as October moved toward November, that the story would require a departure, a loss, a grief to be processed. But Sepha was still there the next morning, and the morning after, and the door was still in its corner of the kitchen, warm at the frame, that thin line of amber light at the bottom. What changed was only Maren's relationship to the needing of it. She had begun, on certain days, to find that she did not need to go through the door at all. She would stand at the kitchen window with her tea, watching the morning come in over the marsh, and the feeling of the room would come to her here, the warmth, the spaciousness, the sense of being accompanied by something patient and good. She did not need to travel to it. It traveled to her. On those days, she would turn from the window and go about her morning with the feeling tucked into her, the way you tuck warmth into a coat before stepping outside. She went through the door on the days when she needed it. She did not go through on the days when she didn't. This felt, to Maren, like a healthy arrangement. November arrived with its particular sobriety, stripping the last color from the reeds, turning the marsh to pewter and silver and the gray of old wood. She loved November with a love she had always found difficult to explain to people who considered it a bleak month. She loved its austerity. She loved the way it simplified everything, pared the landscape down to its structure, the bones of the land visible without their usual cover of green and gold. She loved the quality of the sky, which was high and pale, and seemed to absorb sound, giving the world a muffled, contemplative hush. She walked the marsh path in the mornings with her hands in her pockets and her breath preceding her. And the herons were still there, as motionless as ever, doing their ancient patient thing. She had been watching herons her whole life and still had not solved them. She admired this about them, the way they declined to be understood, declined to offer any explanation for themselves. She received a letter back from her friend. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, in a small cream envelope with familiar handwriting. And Maren stood at the letterbox at the end of her path and held it for a moment before she opened it. She felt, very clearly, the same sensation she had described to Sepha, the chest opening, the room expanding. She opened the letter in the cold November morning, standing at the end of her path with the marsh behind her, and read it there. And the letter was warm and simple and covered 2 pages, and it ended, "I have thought about you often too. It is so good to hear your voice, even like this, even like this, even through the thin medium of paper and ink and the several hundred miles between them. She brought the letter to Sepha that afternoon and read it aloud. And Sepha listened with her eyes half closed, her needles making their steady sound. And when Maren finished, Sepha simply said, "There, just that, there." But she said it with such completeness that it was not a small word at all. The blue-green knitting had grown considerably. Maren had tried more than once to identify what it was becoming. A shawl, she thought, or perhaps something that didn't have a name yet, something that would declare its own purpose when it was ready. She had stopped asking. On the last day of November, a day so still and clear that the marsh looked drawn in silver pencil, every reed reflected precisely in the dark water, Maren came through the door and found that Sepha was not in her chair. She was standing by the shelves at the back of the room, lifting things down carefully, examining them, setting some aside and returning others. She turned when Maren entered and gestured to the small wooden boxes on the floor. "Help me remember what's in these," she said. "I've had them so long I can't always tell from the outside." They spent the afternoon opening boxes. Some held dried herbs so old their smell had become abstract, not lavender or sage, but the memory of them, the idea. Some held objects that resisted description. A smooth pebble worn flat on one side, a small brass ring, a folded square of cloth the color of sunset. Some held nothing but a smell, which was itself something, and Maren tried to name each one as she came to it. Beeswax, cedar, rain on warm stone, bread from years ago, the inside of a childhood coat. Sepha listened to each naming and nodded, and sometimes said yes, and sometimes said close, and sometimes only smiled. At the end of the afternoon, the boxes were returned to the shelves in a slightly different order, and Maren understood without being told that this was important, though she could not have said why. The reordering of things according to their nature rather than their acquisition. The return of things to where they belonged. She drove home along the marsh path in the purple November dusk, and the first stars were arriving in the east, and she thought about all the things she was keeping now, all the things she had added to the list in the green notebook. The morning with the frozen reeds, the spider's web, the walk to post the letter, the afternoon with the boxes, and the smell of rain on warm stone, and Sepha's single there when she had finished reading. She was not keeping them in order to possess them. She was keeping them the way the marsh kept things, holding them in the water's surface, reflecting them back clear and undistorted, not to preserve them forever, just to attend to them, to say, "I was here for this. This was here for me." She went to bed that night with the feeling of accumulated warmth around her, like something folded and familiar. The stars were clear and cold outside the window. The marsh breathed. She breathed with it. December arrived differently than expected. Maren had assumed, the way she always did, that December would bring with it a tightening, the acceleration of the calendar, the accumulation of obligation, the sense of being carried faster than she wanted to go. But this year, the month came in quietly, as if it, too, had been spending time in rooms with low fires and had learned to pace itself. She bought a small tree from the village and set it in the corner of the sitting room and hung it with lights. And in the evenings, she turned off all the other lamps and sat with just the tree and the fire and a book. And the sitting room was so full of amber and soft gold that it seemed to be made of the same material as Sepha's room, as if the two spaces had begun to share a quality of light. She noticed she was eating differently. Not more or less, but more slowly, more attentively. She sat at the table when she ate instead of standing at the counter, and she tasted things. She had lost the habit of tasting things years ago and recovered it now without quite deciding to. The way you recover old abilities when the conditions are right. The body remembering what the mind had let go. She cooked more. Long, slow things, soups that went on the stove in the morning, and filled the house by afternoon with a warmth that was both smell and steam. A warmth that seemed to lower itself from the ceilings the way weather descends from the sky. She made bread again, the first time in a year, and the kitchen filled with that wooden yeast smell. And she sat at the table while it baked and did nothing at all for 40 minutes, and felt that the nothing was as nourishing as the bread. She went through the small door on the winter solstice. Sepha's room was decorated for the day, not dramatically, not with anything garish, but the shelves had small candles on them, perhaps a dozen in all, burning very quietly. And there were branches with red berries laid across the mantelpiece, and the fire was slightly larger than usual, brighter, as if it had been given a little more to work with. The smell in the room was deeper, something resinous, like pine, underneath the usual wood smoke and herbs. Maren sat in her chair and looked at the candles. The longest night, Sepha said. She was not knitting for once. She was simply sitting, her hands in her lap, the blue-green object somewhere nearby, but set aside. Does it mean anything to you, the solstice? It means everything has reached its furthest point in one direction and will now begin moving back. She looked at the fire. I've always found that comforting. The turning. The knowledge that the darkness is not a destination, but a turning point. They watched the fire together for a while. I've been thinking, Maren said, about what you said, that the door was always inside me. Yes, I think I understand it better now. She paused, finding the right words. I think the door is the state of being available to comfort, available to receive it. I've spent a lot of years either rushing past it or telling myself I didn't need it. And what I found here, what you gave me, was practice in standing still long enough for it to find me. Sepha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is exactly right. And the simplicity of it, the completeness of it, that is exactly right, felt like something being tied off, a final stitch. The way a piece of knitting is finished, each loop secure, the whole thing held together by nothing but its own careful construction. Maren looked at the blue-green object in Sepha's lap. Is it finished? Almost. Sepha picked it up and held it out. Maren took it. It was a blanket, small, perhaps 30 inches square, the kind of size you would lay across your lap on a winter evening or fold under your head on a good afternoon. The blue-green was even more beautiful as a whole piece than it had been as accumulating rows, complex in its simplicity. Different colors visible depending on the angle of the light. It's warm, Maren said. It was warm, remarkably warm, as if the knitting held heat the way a stone holds sun. "Take it," Sepha said. "It was always going to be yours." Maren held the blanket and felt, rising through her, the gratitude she had described, the chest opening, the room inside her expanding, the feeling that there was more space in there than she had known. She held it until it settled into something quieter, something like simple recognition. Of course, the way the best gifts feel, not surprising so much as inevitable, as if they had always been on their way. She stayed until the solstice candles had burned lower and the fire had reached its midpoint. Then she folded the blanket carefully and tucked it under her arm and said good night to Sepha. And Sepha said, as always, "Come back when you're ready." And Maren ducked through the small door back into her kitchen. She stood in the kitchen in the December night, the blanket in her arms, and looked out at the marsh. The sky was heavy with cloud and absolutely still, the air waiting. And then, as she watched, the first snow began to fall, not quickly, not dramatically, but in the way everything good arrived in this life, quietly, without announcement, finding everything below it exactly as it was. The marsh went white. The snow kept coming. Maren made tea and wrapped the blue-green blanket around her shoulders and sat at the kitchen table with the door in its corner, a thin line of amber at the bottom, and her green notebook open before her. She added the last item of the year to her keeping list: the blanket, the first snow, the night everything turned. The year turned, as years do. January came, and with it the particular silence of a landscape under sustained snow, a silence that was not empty, but full of stillness, full of held things, the way a library is full of quiet. Maren walked the marsh path every morning in her warmest coat, the snow compacted to a dry squeak beneath her boots, the sky above the reeds, sometimes white, sometimes a thin pale blue that hurt, pleasantly, to look at directly. She had begun to sleep differently. She had always been a reluctant sleeper, even from childhood, someone who came to sleep the way some people come to surrender, fighting the loss of consciousness until exhaustion made the decision for her. But this winter, she found herself welcoming it, turning toward it the way you turn toward a warm room in the cold, lying down and feeling the bed receive her with the same completeness she had felt in Sepha's low chair, and letting the day go without having to undo it first. She had not understood before this year how much energy she had spent each night trying to resolve the day before she was allowed to rest, reviewing what had gone wrong, rehearsing tomorrow, playing out conversations that hadn't happened and might never happen. She had treated sleep like the bottom of a to-do list, something to be reached only when everything else was complete. What she understood now was that the day did not need to be resolved before she could rest. The day would continue to be whatever it was, regardless of her nightly reviews. Sleep was not a reward at the end of a completed day. Sleep was a return to something essential. A door, not unlike the small door in the kitchen, that opened onto the deeper country, the one that existed beneath the ordinary surface of things. She mentioned this to Sepha in late January, on a day when the snow had started again outside, and the kitchen was warm with the smell of soup, and the fire in Sepha's room was the fullest and brightest she had seen it. Sepha nodded slowly. "The body knows how to rest," she said. "It has always known. We only interrupt it." She clicked her needles. She had begun something new now, in a soft gray wool the color of morning fog. The practice is not learning to rest. The practice is learning to stop interrupting it. How do you stop? You find your way back to the same place enough times that the body starts to recognize the path. She glanced up. "You have been finding your path." She looked back at her knitting. "You know where it goes now." Maren thought about the path by the marsh, the one she walked every morning, the snow-compacted gravel, the reeds on each side, the particular curve at the halfway point where the water opened wide on the left, and you could see all the way to the gray horizon. She had walked it so many times that she could walk it in the dark, which she sometimes did when the winter nights were long and still and the stars were enough. Her feet knew it. Her body carried the knowledge of it without her mind having to manage the information. She understood what Sepha meant. She had been building a path to rest, not through discipline or technique or the application of effort, but through repetition, through return, through the simple act of lying down and intending to rest rather than to accomplish anything. Through treating sleep as a place she was going toward rather than a state she was falling into. The gray wool in Sepha's hands accumulated slowly through January. On one of the last days of the month, Maren came through the small door to find that Sepha was not alone. There was a girl on the rug near the fire, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, sitting cross-legged in a red cardigan, feeding small pieces of wood into the fire under Sepha's guidance. She had brown braids and serious dark eyes, and the particular stillness of a child who was accustomed to listening. She looked up when Maren entered and did not seem startled. "My granddaughter," Sepha said, as if this required no further explanation. "Lena," the girl said, in a clear, careful voice. "Maren," Maren said. They regarded each other with mutual gravity, and then Lena turned back to the fire, feeding it a piece of wood the size of her forearm, absorbed in the task. Maren sat in her chair and watched the child by the fire and felt something move through her, not sadness exactly, but the thing adjacent to it, the thing that exists alongside love for something you are seeing without possessing it. She had no children of her own by choice and circumstance, and she had made her peace with this long ago. But peace was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling that had been given enough room to exist without urgency. Lena fed the fire with focused attention, and the fire accepted each piece with a quiet shift of flame, and the room was very full of warmth and amber light. And Maren found herself thinking about all the rooms like this one that existed in the world, all the fires tended by all the hands, all the warmth maintained across the cold by the ongoing patient practice of care. It seemed to her suddenly sitting in that warm room, watching that child, listening to the knitting needles and the small voice of the fire, that this was the deepest thing she had learned this year. Not any specific wisdom about loss or time or gratitude, though she had learned all those things too. The deepest thing was simpler. That warmth was something maintained, not given once and stored, but practiced, tended, returned to, and that the practice was available to anyone who was willing to begin it. She looked at Sepha. Sepha was watching her with that look she had sometimes, the look that meant she knew what Maren was thinking, not through any mystical attunement, but simply through the very ordinary intelligence of a person who has paid careful attention to another person for a long time. She nodded once. "That's it," the nod said. "You have it now." Lena fed the fire one more piece of wood, and then sat back and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the flames with great satisfaction. Outside, the snow was still falling. The thing about good things is that they do not always announce their endings. February brought a thaw. Maren woke one morning to the sound of water, not rain, but melt. The snow releasing its grip on the roof tiles and the window ledges and the low branches of the willow at the edge of the property, sliding off in long, slow sheets and landing with a soft, definitive sound below. She lay in bed and listened to it, and it was one of the most satisfying sounds she could remember, the sound of winter loosening, of the world beginning to move again after its long stillness. She went to the window, and the marsh was there, below, transformed. The snow was still on the far bank and on the tops of the reeds, but the open water was dark and moving, and there were birds, 3 herons, and a pair of gray ducks, and a whole community of small, fast birds she could never identify, going about their morning with an air of renewed purpose. The sun was already higher than it had been even a week ago, and the light it cast was the winter-specific gold she loved, flat and warm and sideways, reaching under things rather than over them. She made her tea and stood at the window for a long time. She had the feeling that morning that something was completing itself, not ending, completing. The way a season completes itself, which is not the same as stopping. The way a piece of knitting completes itself when the final stitch is made, and the work can be taken off the needles and held up whole, beginning and end joined. She had this feeling again in the evening when she came through the small door and found Sepha's room subtly changed. It was the same room, same fire, same shelves, same clay pot with its white flowered plant, now fuller and taller than it had been in October, the flowers more abundant. But there was a quality to the air that was different, fuller somehow, richer. The way a room feels the day before someone leaves it, not with absence, but with presence, every object more vivid in its occupancy. Sepha was at the narrow table, writing. Maren had never seen her write before. She was bent over a piece of paper with a pen, and her handwriting, Maren could see it from the doorway, was the same handwriting that had been on the note. The one that said the door is yours now. Sepha looked up. "Sit down," she said. "I'll be a moment." Maren sat and looked at the fire. She did not feel anxious or sad. She felt very precisely the way she felt at the end of a deeply satisfying book. The approach of the last pages held with both regret and gratitude. The regret and gratitude so evenly balanced that they produced together something almost like joy. Sepha set down the pen and came to her chair with 2 cups. Tea. She had made tea without Maren noticing, and she held one cup out, and Maren took it, and the cup was warm, and the tea smelled of something clean and old, something that had been grown in a very specific soil and dried in a very specific light. "Do you know what this place was for?" Sepha asked. Maren considered. "A stopping place," she said, "for learning to stop." "Yes." She sipped her tea. "For learning to stop and discover that stopping was not the same as giving up. That rest was not the same as absence. That a fire left alone will still burn if it was built well." She looked at Maren. "You built well this year. I had help. You had a door and a room and someone to sit with." Sepha held her cup in both hands. "The building was yours." They drank their tea. "The fire was very steady, very full of itself, very thoroughly alive." "The door will stay," Sepha said after a while. "In the kitchen. In you." She looked at the fire. The kitchen door was always a translation, a way for the idea to make itself visible until you could see it without help. She glanced over. "You can see it now." Maren thought about the feeling that had come to her at the window in the mornings, the warmth and spaciousness arriving without the aid of the physical door. She thought about the path she had built, the path her body knew now, that led to rest. She thought about the blanket in the sitting room, folded on the back of her reading chair, which kept its warmth even in the coldest weeks. "Yes," she said, "I can see it." The conversation after that was the easiest they had ever had. They talked about the marsh in different seasons, and about Lena, who had apparently shown a strong early interest in the fire and the herbs and the objects in the boxes, and about a book Maren had read and a walk Sepha had taken in her youth along a coast she described in the long, slow sentences of someone recalling something beloved from a great distance. When Maren finally rose to leave, the fire had burned to its lower, warmer phase, and the room felt close and held and deeply itself. She paused at the small door and turned back. "Thank you," she said. It was a simple thing to say, and she said it simply. Sepha raised her hand, not waving exactly, but an acknowledgement, a recognition. The gesture of one traveler to another when their paths have briefly run together. Maren went through the door. In the kitchen, the thaw was still dripping from the eaves, a slow percussion in the February dark. She stood and listened to it for a moment, the irregular rhythm of it, the sound of the world releasing what it had been holding for months. She thought, this is what it sounds like when something lets go gracefully. She went to bed with that thought, and it kept her company all the way down into sleep, which came now like an old friend, a visitor who knew the house, who went straight to the warm room and sat down without needing to be shown. In the spring, the white flowered plant bloomed outside. Maren did not know when it had appeared in the garden. She could not account for its arrival any more than she had been able to account for the door in October. But there it was in April, growing against the south wall of the house between the lavender and the rosemary, taller than it had been in Sepha's room, its white flowers catching the spring light and releasing, when the day was warm enough, that smell still clean, still living, still carrying with it the particular suggestion of a room where someone had been sitting quietly for a very long time. She left it where it was. The small door in the kitchen had remained through the winter, warm at its frame, its thin line of amber, light, steady, and constant. She still went through it sometimes, not every day, not even every week, but on the days when she needed the room, the fire, the company of the needles, and the quiet, and the unhurried warmth of being received exactly as she was. On those days, she went through the door and sat in her chair and felt herself held and tended and accompanied. And then she came back out and continued with her ordinary life, which she loved more than she had known before this year, which she tended with more care. The letter exchange with her friend had grown into something ongoing. They had spoken on the phone twice, and the conversations had been exactly as she had hoped, the careful reconstruction of closeness, the recognition of each other across the distance of years, like spotting a known constellation in an unfamiliar sky. Her friend had mentioned in her second letter that she was coming to the coast in June, and they had, tentatively, made plans. Plans. The small, hopeful architecture of a future. Maren sat at the kitchen table on an April morning with the window open, and the garden smell coming in wet earth and last year's rosemary, and the first green shoots of something unidentified pushing through the dark soil. And she wrote in her green notebook. Not the keeping list. She had begun a new kind of writing, slower and more exploratory. The writing you do when you are not trying to record something, but trying to understand it. She wrote about the year, about the door appearing in October, and the woman in the room, and the white flowered plant, and the letter she had finally sent, and the solstice candles, and the child by the fire, and the February thaw dripping from the eaves, and the blanket in blue-green wool that was now in permanent residence on the back of her reading chair, and which she reached for, without thinking, every evening as the light changed. She wrote about learning to stop interrupting herself, about the path to rest that her body had learned to walk without her mind's constant management, about gratitude as a room rather than a feeling, about the difference between peace and the absence of feeling. She wrote for a long time. When she finally stopped, the sun had moved across the kitchen, and the tea was cold, and the garden outside was full of bird sound, small, busy, ordinary birds, doing their bird things without apology in the warm April morning. She closed the notebook. She went to the small door and crouched down and opened it. The room was empty. The fire was still burning, low and steady, the way a fire burns in an empty house that is nonetheless being tended. The shelves held their jars and boxes and stones. The clay pot stood in its place, its white flowers moving gently in the warm air current. Sepha's chair was empty. On the seat of Maren's chair, laid carefully, was Sepha's knitting, the new gray piece, unfinished, the needles still in place, the yarn trailing off to the ball on the floor. A note was tucked into the knitting, in the familiar handwriting, the one that felt like her own. Keep going. It keeps going. That was all. Maren stayed crouched at the door for a moment, looking at the room. The fire gave back its ordinary warmth. The white flowers moved. The note said what it said. She understood that what the note meant was not an instruction about the knitting, though she thought she would learn to knit eventually. What it meant was, the practice does not end. The fire needs tending. The path needs walking. The door inside her needs opening regularly, gently, on the days when rest is required, and the days when warmth is needed, and the days when something needs to be set down, at least for a while, at least for a night. Keep going. It keeps going. She closed the door gently. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the room she lived in, the low cream walls, the bookshelves in every room including this one, the window full of April garden, the cast iron pan on the stove. The ordinary, beloved, reliable rooms of her ordinary, beloved life. She made more tea. She sat in the garden in the afternoon, and the plant with the white flowers bent very slightly toward her in the warm air, and she sat with her face tilted to the sun for a long time without thinking about anything in particular, which had once been difficult and was now simply what happened when everything was as it should be. The evening came in slowly, the way warm water fills a bath. She went inside. She turned on the lamps. She made dinner. She ate it, tasting everything at the table without rushing. She did the dishes and dried them and put them away. She went to bed when she was tired, which was the only right time. She lay down and felt the bed receive her. She felt the day settle. She felt the warmth of the blanket, the blue-green warmth, the made with care warmth, and beneath it, her own warmth, the warmth that had always been there, the warmth she had finally, this year, learned to trust. Outside, the spring night was soft and dark, and the marsh breathed its long, slow breath, and the reeds moved in their gentle water standing way, and the stars were coming out one at a time over the pale horizon, unhurried, each one finding its place. She breathed in. She breathed out. She felt the day let go of her, gently, the way a hand opens when it is ready. She felt herself descend, unhurried, into the deep, warm country of rest, the country she knew now, that she had been practicing all year, that was always there below the surface of the ordinary day, waiting for her with its amber light and its steady fire, its patient warmth, its simple, enduring invitation. Come in, then. You don't have to ask anything. Just sit. The fire will do the rest. And the night held everything, and the marsh held everything, and the room inside her was warm and full of light, and she went all the way down into sleep, easy, complete, unhurried, the way a river goes down to the sea. All the way down, all the way.